8th of June 1997, we begin the Sutta talks on the Nikayas. We know the Nikayas contains the original suttas, discourses of the Buddha. So first, I'd like to talk about the importance of studying the suttas. We find that the Buddha, he struggled for about 6 years to attain enlightenment, and during that time he struggled very hard and went through various teachers and all that, and finally he attained enlightenment. And even the traditional books says that he struggled for many lifetimes, but we find that when his disciples came to learn from the Buddha, some of them attained enlightenment after 7 days, like Mahamoggallana, and the Venerable Mahakassapa took 8 days, and Sariputta took 14 days. So we know that the Buddha's wisdom is supposed to be one of the greatest, and yet he took 6 years of struggling to attain enlightenment, whereas some of his disciples took only a few days. So the difference here is that his disciples learned the path, the teachings from the Buddha, and then they practice and they attain enlightenment in a very short time. Now, so these discourses of the Buddha are actually concerned with the path, the spiritual path, the way out of enlightenment. So that's why it is very important for us to study the Buddha's words, because then that will be the shortest path for us. We also know, for example, that the external ascetics, some of them practice for a long time and even attain the jhanas, and yet they did not attain the paths and the fruitions, the stages of Aryahood. And that was only because they did not hear the Dhamma, the Buddha's teachings. And even though they attained the jhanas and their minds were supposed to be quite clear, and yet they miss the stages of Aryahood. And the other thing is, we see from the suttas that the Buddha's disciples are called savakas, which is Pali for listeners or hearers. In Sanskrit it is shravakas. And the meaning is that the Buddha's disciples listen to the Buddha's words. And when they listen to the Buddha's words in the suttas, we find that many of them attain stream entry. And the Buddha said the condition for stream entry was listening to the words of a teacher and having thorough consideration, yoniso manasikara, considering very carefully, paying close attention to the words of the teacher, reflecting on it. In other words, reflecting on the Dhamma, and then they attain unshakable faith in the Buddha, Dhamma and Sangha. And as a result of that, they had a clear understanding of karma, so they kept their precepts very purely. These were conditions for stream entry. So that again shows the importance of studying the Nikayas. Now, nowadays, it is already 2,500 years after the Buddha passed into Mahaparinibbana. And in the suttas, we find that the Buddha said, after 500 years, the teachings of the Buddha will be polluted. There will be wrong teachings that will appear 500 years after the Buddha's passing away. And now, 2,500 years, we can expect much more polluted teachings. So, even the original Pali canon, nowadays people talk about the Tripitaka or Tipitaka, the three repositories, three treasuries of the Buddha's teachings. And this word, surprisingly, to many people, this word was never mentioned by the Buddha, the Tipitaka or Tripitaka. We find in the discourses of the Buddha that what the Buddha talked about was Dhamma Vinaya. Vinaya being the monk's disciplinary code. And Dhamma, in the discourses of the Buddha, was definitely the suttas. The Buddha referred to the Dhamma as the suttas and nothing else. And so nowadays we find a lot of controversial books. And some are not controversial, some are controversial. And out of the many books now available, the four Nikayas in the Sutta Pitaka, the four Nikayas are a set of books that are definitely non-controversial. It is accepted by all the sects of Buddhism as the teachings of the Buddha. Now, these four Nikayas are found in our Pali canon in Theravada. It is also found in the Mahayana books, and in the Mahayana books, they are called the Agama Sutras. The Agama Sutras, and these, although they are labeled as small vehicle teachings, Hinayana teachings by the Mahayana, nevertheless, they accept that these are the original words of the Buddha. So, since nobody disputes or nobody doubts that the four Nikayas are the original teachings of the Buddha, that is the best books to rely on, because there is no doubt at all as to their being the original teachings of the Buddha, whereas others are a bit controversial. In fact, if we study the four Nikayas, the early four Nikayas of the Buddha, which means the Digha Nikaya, Majjhima, Sangyutta Nikaya, and Anguttara Nikaya, we find that there are no contradictions in the suttas, in these four Nikayas. Whereas in other books, there are contradictions that appear among the books, the controversial books, as well as there are certain things in there that contradict these four original Nikayas. So the focus of our attention in these talks will be on the four Nikayas. And another thing is, the Buddha always taught us to take refuge in the triple gems. The triple gems, the first one being the Buddha, the second being the Dhamma, the teachings of the Buddha, and the third one being the Sangha. In certain cases, it is referred to as the Arya Sangha. Sometimes in the Sutta, the Buddha also talks about Bhikkhu Sangha, taking refuge in the Bhikkhu Sangha also. Now, there are, I think, two suttas where the Buddha had already passed into Mahaparinibbana, and then an Arahant, he was teaching a layman. And the layman was so impressed by the Arahant that the layman wanted to take refuge with the Arahant. But the Arahant said, you cannot take refuge with me. You still must take refuge with the Buddha, Dhamma and Sangha. Then this man thought that the Buddha was still alive. He asked, where is the Buddha now? And the Arahant said, the Buddha has already passed into Nibbana. But even though he has passed into Nibbana, you still must take refuge with the Buddha, Dhamma and Sangha. This implies that our teacher, our only teacher, is the Buddha. And that is why the Buddha could foresee that in the years to come, there would be a lot of wrong teachings. That was why he purposely asked us to take refuge in the Buddha, Dhamma and Sangha. And there was a second Sangha Council meeting that was held about 100 years after the Buddha's passing into Nibbana, in which 10 issues were debated and they were resolved. And one of the 10 issues was that whether we should listen to our teacher all the time. And it was decided that if our teacher teaches according to what the Buddha teaches, we should listen to him. But if he teaches something that contradicts what the Buddha says, we should not listen to him. That is very clear that our teacher is only the Buddha, the original, and the Dhamma, the original teachings of the Buddha. That is why it is very important to have a good understanding of the suttas. Sometimes we find it has happened. We find some people, like about a year ago, there was a lady who practiced meditation for, I heard, something like 20 years and even teaching people. But because the foundation in the Dhamma was not strong enough, she gave up the Buddha's teachings and just gave up the Buddhist religion and renounced the Buddhist religion. And that is a result of not having a good foundation in the teachings of the Buddha. Now I'll go into an overview of the Nikayas. Nikayas means the collections of the Buddha's discourses in the Sutta Pitaka. And the discourses are called Sutta in Pali and Sutra in Sanskrit. And there are 5 Nikayas, 5 collections now in our Theravada Sutta Pitaka. The first one is Digha Nikaya, long discourses of the Buddha. And there are 34 long discourses of the Buddha, and they are spread out over 3 books. 3 books. And then the second one is Majjhima Nikaya, which consists of 152 suttas, spread out also over 3 books. The third one is the Sangyutta Nikaya. Majjhima Nikaya is the collection of middle-length discourses of the Buddha, or medium-length discourses of the Buddha. Sangyutta Nikaya, Sangyutta means a group, so it is a collection of short discourses, grouped according to topics. So in the Sangyutta Nikaya, we find there are 56 Sangyuttas, 56 groups of discourses, and they are all grouped according to topics. For example, you have the Devata Sangyutta, I think that's the first one, and in there, all the suttas have something to do with Devata, the heavenly beings. And then, for example, you have Mara Sangyutta, and in the Mara Sangyutta, all the discourses have to do with Mara. Mara plays a part in the discourses. Then you have, for example, Satipatthana Sangyutta. In the Satipatthana Sangyutta, you find all the suttas are concerned with Satipatthana. So to have a good understanding of Satipatthana, you have to study the Satipatthana Sangyutta, not just the Satipatthana Sutta. Satipatthana Sutta is just one sutta that talks a bit about Satipatthana, whereas there are so many discourses in the Satipatthana Sangyutta that explains the Satipatthana from different angles, and so on and so forth. You have other Sangyuttas. So now in the Sangyutta Nikaya, there are over 2,000 short discourses, short suttas. And Sangyutta Nikaya is a very, very important collection of discourses because they deal with very specific topics and very technical, and it explains very detailed about various things, Magga, path, Satya, truth, etc. Now the fourth one is Anguttara Nikaya. Anguttara Nikaya is a collection of short discourses, also grouped, but grouped according to the numerical content of the sutta. So you have the groups are called Nipata. You can translate them as chapters. So you have 11 chapters, 11 Nipata. The first one is Ekaka Nipata, chapter of the ones. And then Dukkha Nipata. Dukkha is D-U-K-A, not the suffering, but Dukkha here means two. So it's a chapter of the twos. And then Tikka Nipata, chapter of the threes, etc. And there are 11 Nipatas, 11 chapters. So, for example, under chapter of the ones, all the suttas have to do with one thing. And under the twos, every sutta has got to do with two things. etc. And there are also over 2,000 suttas in the Anguttara Nikaya, and there are 5 books. The Sangyutta Nikaya also has 5 books. Anguttara Nikaya also has 5 books. Now the 5th one is the Khuddaka Nikaya. Khuddaka Nikaya literally means minor collection. Minor collection. In other words, some discourses which were were discovered later, which could not be fitted into the early 4 Nikayas. They were grouped into the Khuddaka Nikaya, minor collection. And they expected it to be minor, not many books. But what happened over the last 2,500 years was monks started to add more and more books into that minor collection. So now it has grown into 15 books. So it is not the minor collection anymore, it has become the major collection. And in 1956, the Burmese had a Sangha Council where they added another 3 books. And we know that these 3 books are not the words of the Buddha. And so from there, we can understand why it is over the last 2,500 years, the Khuddaka Nikaya has grown bigger and bigger and bigger. And so now out of the 15 books, and according to the Burmese 18 books, only about 5 are reliable. And if we have time later, we'll go into the 5 books also. The 5 books are not controversial. People accept them as the original teachings of the Buddha. And over the last 100 years, only the Pali Text Society has made a great effort to translate all these suttas into English. And they have managed to do it very well. And until recently, they were the only people who have translated all the Nikayas into English. And it's only, that means for the last 100 years, they were the only group of people who translated the suttas completely into English. And only the last 2-3 years, there have been new translations, like for example, the latest translation of the long discourses of the Buddha is by Maurice Walsh, Dr. Maurice Walsh in England. And at first it was called, the thin cover edition was called Thus Have I Heard. Now they've made it into a thick cover and called it the Long Discourses of the Buddha. And then the second one, Majjhima Nikaya, there's also a new translation by Venerable Bhikkhu Nyanamoli and Venerable Bhikkhu Bodhi. And it's called the Middle Length Discourses of the Buddha. So these are the latest translations. And then the other 2, Sangyutta Nikaya and Anguttara Nikaya, we still have to rely on the Pali Text Society edition because there's no other edition that is complete. So now I will go into the Anguttara Nikaya. Because why I select the Anguttara Nikaya as the first Nikaya to go into, because it's the comparatively easier collection to go into, and a lot of the discourses there are concerned with lay people's lives. So it is not so technical, and yet there are some technical things in there. And principally because it's easier to understand. So we'll go into the Anguttara Nikaya. Now I won't go into all the suttas because there are over 2,000 suttas. I will go into most of the suttas, those that are important. And then I will try to read it out, explain it, and explain the implications of the sutta, as well as compare it with other suttas to give you a better idea, because usually a sutta will tell you something from one angle, and unless you compare it with some other suttas, you might get a biased view. Now this Anguttara Nikaya is, I think, the only collection of discourses that does not have a name for every sutta. The original Pali edition, they did not have a name for each of the suttas. They only had a sutta number. So I will give the sutta number, and the sutta numbers that I give are all the Pali Text Society numbers, so that if you want to check the sutta, you can look up the Pali Text Society translation of the Anguttara Nikaya, which is called the Gradual Sayings. There are 5 books there. Now, I will give a 1-hour talk, and then after that, which is recorded, after that I will stop. Then I invite you all to come up with any questions or any comments on what has been talked on. Now, the sutta numbers of the Anguttara Nikaya, generally it's like Anguttara Nikaya X.Y.Z. Now, the first number, X, is the Nipata number. That means the chapter. And it only varies from 1 up to 11. You only get 1 up to 11. In the Pali text translation, they call it Book of the Ones, Book of the Twos, Book of the Threes. But I prefer to use the number, the word chapter. So, if you say for example, you have a sutta called 5.7.13. 5 is the Nipata, that means the chapter of the 5s. And then the second number, 6, is the Vaga. Vaga is the section number, because every chapter is divided into sections, Vagas. And after that, every section is divided into sutta numbers. So the last number, Z, is the sutta number. So like 5.6.13. The 13 is the sutta number, the 13th sutta in the 6th section of the chapter of the 5s. That is 5.6.13.